In this video, I'm going to cover the second half of the introduction to the scientific method and the process of research by covering the distinction between research production and research consumption. So despite the fact this class is focused on getting you engaged in the process of research production, which is its own unique set of skills, even if you go on and do no more research yourself in the remainder of your life, you will inevitably be a consumer of research. We're really bombarded with research in the news, on the internet, from the people we talk to, that it's really important to understand that just understanding or consuming research requires its own unique set of skills. To justify this point, I think it's important to make sure to really think about just why it is important to learn research consumption skills. You might be thinking to yourself, I'm a smart person. I don't need training to tell what's bogus from what's legit. I have my own opinion. And that's perfectly fair. Of course, you're an agent of free will and you can decide what you think is legit or not. But really, at baseline, people in general are pretty scientifically illiterate. We're really bad without training from being able to tell what's legit and what's bogus and what's junk. The problem is sort of our built in psychology, our biases, and our heuristics. So we use a lot of sort of flawed ways to try and understand the world that leave us with an incomplete or inaccurate picture of the truth. So, for example, we often see connections where there are not any, while we fail to see the ones that are there. A really important example of this and how both of these failings can have some pretty dire consequences is like the anti-vax movement, for example. The movement or phenomenon of people who don't trust the safety or efficacy of vaccines. That is an entire movement based on scientific illiteracy. Vaccines are perfectly safe and they have saved untold numbers of lives since their advent. So, why do people mistrust vaccines? Well, people see connections where there aren't any. An anti vaxxer might tell you that autism is onset at the same time that children tend to receive the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. And they say, well, there's got to be an association there. Well, you're seeing a connection where there isn't any, because just because vaccines and the onset of autism symptoms happen to occur at the same developmental stage does not actually mean they're causally linked, right? The age where you get vaccines also happens to be the age where you start to be able to speak. So it's really the only time when you could start to observe autism symptoms. So having two events just co-occur at the same time, we are so liable to fall for this sort of phony conclusion that just because two things happen around the same point in time that they're actually linked. Additionally, we fail to see relationships or connections that are there. We're sort of biased by heuristics of what we sort of are used to seeing or what is easily accessible from memory. So, a connection that anti vaxxers might fail to see is they'll say something like, when's the last time somebody died from polio or from smallpox? Those diseases can't be altogether that dangerous. Well, they're failing to see that the reason we can live in a reality where we're not scared of polio and we don't know many people who died of polio is because of the vaccines. So we fail to see that connection because it's not sort of like screaming in our face. Since we're not familiar with the reality of people suffering from polio, we fail to see that it is the vaccines themselves that made that reality possible. So, really, by and large, humans are susceptible to junk, bogus science, and it's just sort of naturally built into the way we think. So, I think this sort of demonstrates that it is important to get some really good, solid scientific skills to be a better consumer of scientific research. And so I would say the answer to this question is yes, absolutely. We need some scientific training and we need to promote scientific literacy so people aren't taken in by garbage, bullshit science. The benefits to being a good, well informed consumer of research is overall you want to be able to tell what's good from bad. And hopefully, I've justified to you that we're really not naturally going to be so great at this. If we're able to tell good from bad research, we're going to be better able to look after our own health and well being. For example, there's so much garbage nutritional research out there, and there's just an overwhelming abundance of garbage fad diets. And we're told that the diets work, that they're effective, and really, there is no fad diet that works for long term weight loss. There's really no quick fix. So, any sort of elimination diet or any sort of crazy ingredient that you add into your diet, there is no good solid research that that's going to help your health or well-being or help you lose weight. So if you want to be able to save your money and create a diet that actually works for you, being able to wade through the bullshit, I think, is valuable. Additionally, you can advocate for the issues that you care about. So if you see some junk science out there, you can be part of the solution. If you talk to someone who seems skeptical about vaccines or is about to undergo some crappy fad diet, you can help advocate and you can help inform people beyond just being informed yourself. And it's important for your pocketbook. Don't waste money on garbage bunk that Dr. Oz or Dr. Drew or Dr. Phil are trying to sell you. You can save your money on all of the bullshit. And it's really important to take into consideration that the consequences of being suckered in by bad research, you might just be out a little bit of money. You might just spend some time on some bunk cabbage soup diet. But there are people out there who are well aware of people's general scientific illiteracy, and they prey on that vulnerability. There's even fake doctors out there who will prey on dying patients by selling them quack bullshit cancer cures. So it's important to understand and be able to identify when some cure or diet or whatever it may be that's being sold to you is bullshit so that you can advocate for yourself, that you can look after your health and well being, any range of benefits from saving your money to maybe saving your life. Now, this is always fun. In terms of this sort of evaluation of good science versus bad science, it would be really tempting and it would be really nice if I could tell you that some topics land cleanly in the garbage column and some are good. Unfortunately, here I want to make sure to highlight that sometimes the answers are not quite so black and white. Some research topics are genuinely controversial and you can come to your own conclusion. And to do so effectively, I think it's just important to dig a little bit deeper. So I'm just going to touch on a series of research topics that you might have noticed in your own experience seem inconsistent or confusing, and think about how you really have to do the work to dig a little bit deeper. There's been tons of research over the years to try and tout the benefits of a glass of red wine. And this is an example of a research topic where people are likely to want to believe it because it just sounds so great. We're constantly told that alcohol is bad for us, that it's bad for all manner of physical health. And then some research comes out and says red wine might have antioxidants that's good for your heart. That excites people because people tend to like alcohol. Here, it's important to be cautious of research that just sounds so good and you're just tempted to believe it just because it makes you happy and it makes you feel good. The red wine research, it's spotty. There's only a couple articles that really find this connection. And overall, it's the antioxidants likely in the red wine, not something about the alcohol itself. So you can get the same benefits of red wine with other things that you consume and not have all of that damage from the alcohol itself. So it's not quite so simplistic. It's about what is it with the red wine that makes it good for you, and can I trust that research, and is it strong enough to actually make alcohol itself seem safe? Overall, the research not quite to that level. One example of a food item that I swear the tides change every 10 years or so are the relationship between eating eggs and your health. There was a time, I would say, through the 90s up through like the aughts, where everyone was always going on about how eggs were so bad for your cholesterol and it was so bad for your health. And the tide has kind of turned, I would say, in the past 10 years or so. I mean, with the prevalence of low and no carb diets now, people think of eggs as a really healthy breakfast and something that you can enjoy um, and indulge in quite frequently. Overall, the research definitely is A little bit all over the place. Yes, eggs seem to have this association with cholesterol, but the question becomes, is cholesterol itself bad for you? Well, there used to be the assumption that cholesterol was bad, but now we know about good cholesterol. So overall, it seems like eggs, yeah, seems fine. One theme in myself looking more into this topic is that most scientists will basically tell you don't go overly hard on anything. Don't eat nothing but eggs. That's not a diverse enough diet. So basically, you probably shouldn't freak out and think that eating eggs is going to give you a heart attack. The overall focus should be on just having a well balanced diet overall. Now, here's a fun example that's meant to illustrate that it's important to think about the motivation of scientific research and to think about maybe who's funding research. It is certainly the case that scientists, being flawed humans, can be susceptible to a bias regarding where the money is coming from. So, a famous example that actually had a cool expose in the New York Times a few years ago was how sugar industries, for example, the Coca Cola Corporation, funded a whole bunch of Harvard research to try and identify fat in your food as the primary component that's bad for your health. I mean, fat, the word itself carries so much stigma. The interesting thing about this particular article that I've linked here is that the expose found that this Harvard research, it did not disclose the funding from all of these corporations with motivations to have sugar have a good reputation. So basically, this research was tremendously biased because the researchers didn't disclose that they might have had a motivation going into the research, right? The sugar industry wanted a scapegoat for people's poor health. They wanted to pinpoint fat. Again, this might seem crazy to those of us living through this low carb, no carb phenomenon, but really throughout the 80s and 90s, it was all about anti fat. So many low fat, no fat foods were marketed and became really popular. Well, that's because of this research. Now, research is pretty clear that a good amount of healthy fat is pretty good for you, and sugar definitely can be pretty bad for your health when you have too much of it. So, looking into who's behind the research is always valuable. And then this is a fun example, and I'm not going to talk too much about it now because the next couple slides I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper. Chocolate as a superfood. This is a really interesting research area trying to see whether or not dark chocolate has a variety of health benefits. And I will say that out of any on this list, the research is sort of as convincing as could be, but definitely it's not so cut and dry as dark chocolate is a superfood that's going to make you live forever. Even when there is an overwhelming array of research on the topic, you still need to dig a little bit deeper. Here's what I mean. In looking up literature reviews on the association between dark chocolate and physical health, I found a lot of really great informational resources, including resources that had extensive scientific citations. So, this is just an example of one article I read that has this extensive references section, all of which are academic and scientific articles. So, that's a really great sign. That indicates that there's lots of really great high quality research on the link between chocolate and health. Now, let's just take one of them. And at this point, I would say, you can't even just read the title to get a really good, clear idea of what is the deal with this research. Take this one, for example: cocoa intake, blood pressure, and cardiovascular mortality. Sounds great, right? That title is telling me a story that chocolate is good for your blood pressure. It maybe makes your blood pressure go down, reduces cardiovascular mortality, makes you less likely to die of a heart attack. This article title is very, very exciting, particularly if you're a huge fan of chocolate. You can't just read the title, though. That's the problem. You gotta still dig deeper. So let's say I even just peruse the abstract of that linked article. Again, the title tells you something. Look a little bit deeper at the methods themselves. Here's what the researchers actually did. So they didn't give some of their participants chocolate and the others didn't have chocolate. They assessed habitual food consumption in a sample of elderly German men, no doubt. You likely listening to me are not an elderly German man, so maybe this doesn't generalize to you anyways. Even disregarding that point, habitual food consumption was assessed over the course of a long term longitudinal study. and cocoa intake was estimated. So here's one flaw to this study, right? They're not priming or manipulating chocolate consumption. They're just asking people about their food habits. They might not be accurate. They might not be remembering right. It's just basically an imperfect proxy. So then what they found was that those in the high chocolate consumption group tended to die less of cardiovascular causes and had better blood pressure levels. Again, this effect is exciting. Certainly, one explanation when you see that chocolate consumption is associated with positive health outcomes is that chocolate causes positive health outcomes. But you can't commit the classic correlation doesn't equal causation mistake. Yes, it's certainly possible that in this sample of elderly German men, their chocolate consumption was the cause of their health outcomes, but it could be something else about chocolate consumption that's causing those better health outcomes. Maybe people who eat more chocolate exercise more to make up for it. Maybe people who eat more chocolate are happier. Maybe happiness makes you live longer, and so you should just do whatever makes you happy, and it's not the chocolate in and of itself. So the story, even though that article is so exciting sounding, and even though there's lots of similarly exciting sounding articles, you need to dig deeper still and don't just settle for whatever interpretation makes you happy. Do your due diligence to really look at the methods themselves and try and figure out what this research tells you. If you love chocolate, makes you happy to eat chocolate, and you think that that's important, do it. But I would encourage you to make sure that you're being thoughtful about the way you consume and interpret your research. So, even just research consumption is tricky, and it takes effort and it takes training. Now, research production, on the other hand, is even harder still. And I'm going to walk you through a few of the important components that go into the actual doing of scientific research. So, what I'm going to walk you through is what we call the theory data cycle. I'm sure you've heard of this before, so I'm hopefully not going to spend too much time on it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the publication process and the process of research becoming more mainstream. So, basically, the life cycles of research, how it is created and how it is manufactured and put out into the world. So the theory data cycle is the sort of ideal sequential flow for the process of research. So one thing that's really important for scientists to do is to kind of not analyze your data blind and sort of ascribe a narrative or an explanation to your data after you've already collected it. You want to start with some really good, solid theoretical predictions and specific hypotheses. So, this theory data cycle basically dictates that the best process for producing research starts with a researcher sort of theorizing and thinking and coming up with explanations. From there, they develop these specific research questions and predictions. They design a study to help assess that prediction, and then they analyze the data to evaluate whether or not the data itself lends support for your theoretical explanation. If there's support for your initial predictions, then that's great. You have support for your theory. You'd probably want to do another study with another hypothesis and get further support. If you don't find support for your initial predictions, you want to revise your initial underlying assumption. So this process helps guide us. It reduces the extent that we're biased in our interpretations. So I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of a theory because it is somewhat of a loaded term these days. Shouldn't be, but it kind of is. A theory is meant to be a well-confirmed type of explanation of natural phenomenon that's developed via the scientific method. What that means is that a theory shouldn't come out of thin air, and it shouldn't just be taken to be true without proof. So a theory should be developed based on series of observations and empiricism and systematic collection of data. And then a theory is only supported once there is a body, a multitude of research studies that help support the veracity of that theory. So theories are not just coming out of nowhere. The basic predictions that come out of your theory, your hypotheses, need to be something that could either contradict or support your theory. It needs to be possible that the evidence shakes out to not support your initial theoretical inclination. And typically, it shouldn't just come out of thin air. So, some sort of background research, some legwork to help develop the theory. So, a series of observations of what you see in the world, consultation with expert resources, so background reading, talking to scientists and experts. And this is an important point. While a theory is never 100% proven, it's more so supported or unsupported. Um, this idea that a theory means that something is pure speculation as a way to dismiss a theory, that's really not what a theory is about. You hear plenty of people who don't believe in the theory of evolution sort of hand wavingly refer to it as just a theory. Well, this is really a misunderstanding of the nature of a theory. The theory of evolution is such because it's such a broad explanation of natural phenomena, but there is an overwhelming abundance of data and evidence that supports that theory. So scientists never want to say with perfect certainty that we are 100% right in our theoretical explanations, just that we have evidence to support it. The basic idea is that there could always be novel evidence that causes you to need to revise your theory. But once a theory has a lot of good, solid backing to it, you can start to take it as well supported, that you can basically trust it. So do not use a theory as a sort of dismissive idea. It's just basically a explanation, your idea of how to explain whatever phenomenon you're interested in. So a classic example of the theory data cycle in practice is Harlow's famous contact comfort theory and hypothesis. So basically, this research study famously helps us walk through the steps of this cycle. So, Harlow first was interested in the classic mammalian behavior of infants clinging to their caregivers. And the basic idea was, well, one explanation is that mammalian infants just need to nurse, and so they cling and cuddle to their caregivers for food. But another explanation is that there's something really important about physical comfort and contact, that basically we have a need to snuggle because it comforts us. So Harlow's paradigm was to say, okay, one of these two explanations needs to be true, so let's actually design a research study to help figure out which is true. So he designed two competing fake monkey moms, as you see here. The left is a completely not cuddly wire monkey mom that delivers milk to the baby. On the right is a cuddly monkey mom covered with a soft cloth that was nice for snuggling, but no milk. The data collected was basically where the baby monkeys wanted to spend their time. Lo and behold, Harlow's idea that there's something important about physical comfort was borne out in the data, as indicated by the fact that the infants pretty exclusively wanted to spend their time with the right cuddly cloth monkey mom. They'd go to the left for food, for sure, you still need food, but any time beyond feeding, the monkeys spend cuddling with the right proxy monkey mom. So you have support for the contact comfort theory. Now, that doesn't 100% prove the contact comfort theory. You'd probably want to do another study. Maybe do another study with humans or another kind of a species. So once you have evidence for a theory, your work's not done. As I mentioned, it's the theory data cycle. So this process sort of continues continually until there is such a convincing body of evidence that the theory is very, very well supported. Okay, so I'm going to hopefully go through this kind of quick because, God, who really wants to listen to me talk this much? But the publication process is what happens after researchers actually do the process of conducting a study. So basically, you write up your results in a manuscript and you submit it for consideration at a journal. There's a absolute ton of journals out there in any possible field. If you're talking scientific journals, there's a ton of sort of cross-disciplinary scientific journals like Nature or Science. The field of psychology has a ton. And then in whatever disciplines within psychology, as you can see here, there's a developmental psychology journal. There's a journal of personality and social psychology. There's many more beyond this. There's hundreds of psychology journals and interdisciplinary journals and niche journals. Basically, if you have some really cool results that emerge from any of your research studies, you would then undergo the process of trying to find a journal where the article would fit with the theme of that journal. So you submit your manuscript for consideration, And then an editor at the journal is going to take a pass at it. And they, at that point, can either desk reject and say they don't think that your manuscript is of sufficient quality, or your research was not of sufficient quality, or it's just not the right fit for the journal, and they can desk reject it. If they think there's a shot for your article eventually being good enough, they'll submit it out for peer review, basically by contacting a series of fellow experts in the field who don't know you, the author. And then those peer reviewers are going to take a look at the article and give their feedback. Based on the editor's opinion and the peer reviewer's feedback, articles and manuscripts can be rejected. Say, sorry, this is never going to be fit for publication here. And at that point, you can take your manuscript elsewhere. They may request revisions. Almost all articles that eventually get published go at least through some rounds of revision, some requests for different writing. It can be stylistic. It can be about different sources that needed to be cited, or they might even ask you to conduct another study entirely. And then if you're lucky, at the end of this entire rigmarole, you get a paper accepted. So this is all the effort that goes into the process of research after you actually do the research. It's this entire process of writing and revision and publication. It takes a lot of time. The entire process functions basically to try and make sure that only the best quality research makes it into the top tier scientific journals. So then from there, if you're lucky, I mean, most articles are basically just going to collect dust and only be read by fellow experts and scientists. Really cool, sexy, or interesting or novel research will often get filtered into mainstream sources. So the news will report on it. You might see people sharing those news stories on social media. Basically, from there, from publication, your research can take on a life of its own. It sort of becomes like a game of telephone, right? Where the interpretation that you, the scientist, had sort of gets a little bit distorted upon every source that it passes through. You know, research is maybe not reported on entirely accurately in the evening news, so then people watching it don't interpret accurately, and it basically goes through this iterative process where maybe by the time it hits mainstream consciousness, it's not even really all that similar to what it initially was about. So this is something that, as someone who produces science, you need to be wary of. You need to make sure that you're doing your best to help people interpret your research correctly. And B, this is another thing to keep in mind as a research consumer, that whenever you hear about research that sounds too good to be true or just sounds like garbage, maybe you just want to go back and consult the original source, because if you're getting your scientific research from mainstream non-scientific outlets, the news, non-scientific publications, or your friends or your peers or social media, keep in mind that it's not from the actual scientists directly. So then I'm going to leave you with a few recommendations I have for where you can find original research so that you can do that due diligence of trying to figure out how to visit the original sources, so you can use your PsycInfo database that I'm sure you're all well versed in. ResearchGate is kind of like LinkedIn for researchers, so you can find publications there pretty easily. Google Scholar is just a subset of a Google search where you only find scholarly results, so books and articles, dissertations. That can be a great way to limit your search to more reputable sources. You can use Wikipedia sparingly. Just make sure that you know that it's not direct scientific research. It's all crowdsourced. So if you're reading a Wikipedia article, do yourself a favor and maybe visit the references section at the bottom so that you can verify the information you read on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a great place to learn. Just don't cite it in your research manuscripts. Use it as a place to start, not a place to finish. Books. I mean, books are written by any old asshole. You need to do some due diligence to see who the book was by and what it was about, and whether or not there's a good deal of solid scientific writing, whether there was sources being cited, for example. So just because something is published in a book doesn't mean it's legit. Look to see whether the author of the book has credentials and whether or not you trust them on the topic. So one example of some really great, basically pop psychology literature that I would recommend is by the dearly departed Dr. Oliver Sacks, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who has a really fantastic series of books outlining some of the most interesting case studies of patients with brain damage that he ever met in his life. So this, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, is one of his most famous. But really, I've never been disappointed by an Oliver Sacks book. So it is pop psychology. It is written for the mainstream, but it's by someone who had a really good, solid reputation and did really good, solid work. And his books are not only entertaining, they're also very educational, very informative. So you just need to do your own due diligence and look into the author of the book and whether or not you trust them. Articles on the internet, any old asshole can write a blog post. So just see who wrote an article that you're reading, if it's published in a source that you can trust, if it's written by someone who's an expert. So, take for example the article a few slides back on humans need training to tell junk science from good science, was written by a PhD astrophysicist. I was comfortable enough with his credentials that I was willing to recommend that article, but I was only willing to recommend that article to you once I looked into the author and did that sort of background check on my own. So then your discussion questions for this week are hopefully somewhat thought provoking. So basically, I went through a list of my favorite controversial topics, health and chocolate, health and alcohol, love it, can't go wrong. Why not think about a controversial topic that you're interested in and find some evidence that either supports or disconfirms it and whether or not you're convinced by it? What's maybe a sort of specific research question and prediction that you could create related to this topic? So basically, just think of a fun research topic that is sort of controversial or interesting, and just think a little bit more about how this process of the theory data cycle applies to your hypothetical topic of interest. So that's going to do it for this round of lectures. I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk to you soon.